Cool. So we can go ahead and officially begin. This is another meeting of the Kubernetes SIG Drupal special interest group. Basically, the goal of this meeting is to discuss all things Kubernetes as they relate to Drupal and potentially how we can impact or help the Drupal project as a whole as a result of these conversations. There's a lot of different companies across the world that are using Kubernetes. It's a very popular project and provides a lot of functionality and utility for systems like Drupal. So very interested to see how this ends up evolving and what comes out of it. To go ahead and kick it off, we tend to do quick introductions, so this should be relatively painless since there's a few of us in here. The first Nick Santamaria, is that how you pronounce your name?
Yeah, nailed it. Yeah, so I'm Nick Santamaria. I work at Prometheus Next in Australia. I'm an engineer working on our Kubernetes and AWS-based hosting platform.
Cool. And I believe we have Brad Jones up next.
Yeah, I'm Brad Jones. I'm in Denver. I do a bunch of Drupal development and increasingly, mostly actually, DevOps stuff. I'm a freelancer, but I also am the product owner at an agency here in town that's building an in-house hosting platform at fruition. So not maybe doing this things at the same scale as some of the rest of you, but all the same problems. So.
Absolutely. I believe we have Ellie next.
Hey there, I'm here in DC. I am a content creator for the most part, but I am getting more and more involved in Kubernetes and building hosting platforms, so I'm still mostly lurking, but hi.
I believe we have the second Nick S up.
Wait, which one? Me? Yep,
Yes,
this
sir.
one. Right. Cool. Hey, yeah, my name's Nick Shu. I'm drinking my first coffee for the morning. I work for Prometheus Next as ops lead. Yeah, I just love running Kubernetes and deploying Drupal on top of it. So yeah, it's just great to see a SIG around that. So yeah, willing to contribute any way I can.
Cool. And I believe Adam is next.
Yeah, my name's Adam Bramley. I work with the two Nicks at Prometheus Next. I'm mainly a Drupal developer and starting to get into Kubernetes over the past year or so.
Cool. Well, pretty small group, so we can move on to the next stage. I think that we generally all have some similarity or some semblance of understanding of who we are. So, Nick, do you want to go ahead and kick off your lightning talk?
Yeah, can do. Just share on the screen. Is that? Can people see my screen?
Yes, sir. That looks great.
Excellent. Cool. All right. So, yeah, as mentioned in the introduction, my name is Nick Santamaria. I work for Prometheus Next on our AWS and Kubernetes-based hosting platform called Skipper. So this lightning talk, I'm just going to give you an overview of how to auto-scale your applications using the horizontal pod autoscaler custom metrics. And my dog is very interested in the postman outside. Sorry about that. All right. So just quickly, a bit of a recap on how the horizontal pod autoscalers work. So, you know, we're all probably using Kubernetes deployments or replication controllers to deploy our applications out. So these objects have a replicas parameter, which is basically the number of pods that you want running at any given time. We then have a horizontal pod autoscaler, which you configure with various thresholds, metrics that you want to, when those thresholds are exceeded, you want to trigger a scaling event. So yeah, that might typically be CPU or memory. So when you reach, say 80% CPU utilization, it'll tell your replication controller that, hey, I'd like an extra instance space. So this is in older versions of Kubernetes, I think version 1.8 and before. this is what the horizontal pod autoscaler object looked like. So it's quite a simple object. You can see that down in the bottom that you've got, you know, a sort of hard-coded key for how the metrics are defined. So this is where the limitations of this object came up, because you really can only scale on CPU and memory. Version 2 came along and it added this new metrics parameter which accepts a list. So now we can give our horizontal pod autoscaler a bunch of metrics to scale on, which, you know, really opens up the possibilities. So this example here, you can see it's scaling on both CPU and memory. Another cool improvement on version 2 of HPA is we now have first-class integration with metrics exposed by other Kubernetes components. So in this example, you can see an example of how, like, scaling your application based on the number of requests per second at the ingress level, which is pretty cool. And you can do this without any sort of custom code or workflows. So yeah, what about custom metrics? Well, in this context, custom refers to anything that's not provided by Kubernetes itself. So we're all running PHP, many of us probably PHP FPM, and, you know, there's potentially a like treasure trove of metrics in there that you might want to scale on, you know, available workers, you know, maybe proc memory consumed and things like that. So I give you the PHP FPM Prometheus exporter project. So this is just on GitHub. It's like pretty solid. And you can see there, this is all of the metrics that it gives you by default. So there's tons of possibilities here for scaling. Now, the next step is, well, how do we get these metrics that are exposed by your PHP FPM pod into your, like, you know, to a point where your horizontal pod autoscaler can use them? Well, then this is when you need a Prometheus adapter. So this is a bit of a high-level chart of how the whole thing looks. And so we basically have a /metrics endpoint on our PHP FPM pods, which Prometheus is scraping. Kubernetes has this metrics aggregator component, which, you know, you can configure it to look at a bunch of different places to pull metrics in and use for your HPAs. But we will have a Prometheus adapter, which sits in between your Prometheus instance and the metrics aggregator. It's just a translation layer, essentially. Now, there's 2 projects I found that allow you to do this, you know, without writing any code yourself. So the first one is probably the more supported one based on, like, you know, some health metrics of the project. There's way more stars and the commit activity is a lot more frequent. But for each of these, there are great blog posts which give you a rundown on how to configure them. Those links are at the end of the talk. So I'm going to quickly go show you the config for that first project. So this is the configuration file for the Prometheus adapter, and it basically is telling you, like, so this query here is called my app client connected, and it has a Prometheus query, and so basically every time the metrics server tries to scrape data from your adapter, it runs that query and exposes it as a metric called my app client connected. And then on your horizontal pod autoscaler, this will be the how you tell it to scale based on that particular metric. So again, like all of that highly complex, you know, metrics gathering system is really just distilled down into this now nice couple of lines of YAML. Now, if like trying to, you know, if you're not running Prometheus currently, or all of that stuff sounds like burden that you're not particularly wanting to run with, then you can roll your own custom metrics API server. Build your own intermediary if you want. So this project from Kubernetes Incubator is essentially the kube builder of custom metric servers. We've had a bit of a play around with that to, basically act as a bespoke adapter between the PHP FPM exporter and the metric server. So I've got a link to that project as well. So that's kind of the end of the overview. I'll put these slides in the agenda doc so that you guys can review them later on.
Cool. Definitely a lot of useful information there. And I do wish that there were a few more people on the call to maybe get you some good questions going, but does anybody have any? It seems like most of you actually work together, so
that's true. So they could fact check me on any of that stuff.
Right. How about you, Brad? Does that ring any bells or have anything of interest?
Well, I mean, it's one question on that is, the vast majority. I mean, I know Previous Next has some big clients, but the vast majority of, I think, the sites, it's kind of the 80-20 rule, or maybe the 99-1 rule on site volume. So at what point do you find that the usual performance enhancing methods that are less complex, right? CDNs, good caching layer, reverse proxy caching layers, all that kind of thing. At what point does this become a thing for your clients? And then secondly, how does this sort of get sold, right? This is all very value added stuff because you're probably, these applications need to be scalable. They need to be written in such a way that they scale and all the rest. So is that broad enough?
Like a few things to unpack there. I guess Drupal, assuming that you're following best practices, is usually quite horizontally scalable. So that's usually a fairly solved problem, especially if you're using managed services for like your shared file system, things like that. As to the question on, what point do you start considering these, value-added things like auto-scaling and custom auto-scaling? It really depends. I mean, like we had a bug in our auto-scaler that we didn't notice for like, I think it was maybe a month or something, and nothing caught on fire. So, I think you could argue that it's, whilst having it is like another layer of kind of, stability and resilience. But for the most part, when you're dealing with day-to-day operations on the 80% of sites, maybe it's not like a must-have thing.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, I'll throw out there, I know there's other questions, obviously we can take those, but it kind of dovetails into an issue that I don't know if I've raised before, but I don't know if anybody has particular thoughts on it, which is like the metrics that come out of like Prometheus, or like, I guess that go into Prometheus from monitoring, especially on GKE, like about memory, are rather opaque. Like the concept of like evictable memory and things like that. It doesn't seem like a lot of that gets sort of surfaced very well. So it seems to me, as looking at these issues, there's a little bit of a garbage in, garbage out component, where sometimes, you have these memory conditions that might not actually be, might not actually track with the actual metrics of the underlying node. But
yeah, there's definitely like like the information Kubernetes aggregates into Prometheus by default can be pretty overwhelming. And honestly, a lot of it I haven't dug into to understand what it is. It's certainly. But I guess like the focus of this talk was more about like, more talking about what the applications themselves are exposing. So I guess, if there's something that matters to your app, like if you've got a queue that you need to scale the number of workers that are processing the queue based on the number of items that are in the queue, then this is quite a cool solution for that. I guess, again, the 80% of sites probably are going to fare very well just with CPU and memory scaling.
Yeah, and that PHP FPM exporter actually adds a lot of really useful information that PHP developers can relate to really quickly. Nick, can you maybe talk a little bit more? You mentioned the concept of standing up of an intermediate API if you're not going with a full-blown Prometheus solution. That might go over quite a few people's heads. Can you maybe talk about why one would want to do that and what it would accomplish?
Well, I think we just played around with it for just cutting out the big Prometheus and Prometheus adapter components. So I think when we were POCing on this, we didn't have Prometheus running on the cluster. And yeah, kind of also, I don't know if it's necessarily something we'll run long term, but it certainly was an interesting experiment just to see how that metrics adaptive framework tool works. Yeah. But I think that it's probably for your vast majority of use cases that using the Prometheus exporter is going to be a better option.
We found a lot of good application in exposing different APIs attached to the Kube API to be able to do things like restrict certain pieces of information or functionality that are deeper in the Kube API to customer level access, essentially. So I was just curious if you were taking an approach kind of similar to that, or what you had.
Oh yeah, no. So that custom adapter, we are not running that in production yet. So yeah, it is very proof of concept at this stage.
Cool.
Yeah, and I think there's like a really big broad discussion about like scaling Drupal in containers, because like this approach is kind of like if you're scaling based on CPU memory and then PHP procs, you're covering like a lot of ground and a lot of edge cases that one may not, like if your CPU is not going up, but you've got like a lot of blocked procs for whatever reason, like it'll scale up because of that. But then there's also like this whole movement around like scaling by HTTP requests, which then kind of brings in this whole extra thing around like, how do you tune an application? Like how do you figure out a Drupal site, like, a pod of X size equals X amount of requests. So yeah, there's this really big like gray area around like best practices to scale Drupal. I think that's a really meaty topic for like these kinds of calls too. Sort of how people are doing it. Because yeah, I think you can get that like 80% or 90% just by turning on CPU auto scaling. But then yeah, there is all this stuff around like HTTP requests and memory and which do help you, but which do save your ass sometimes. But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah,
So
one thing that we're looking to do is actually expose the average amount of memory that the application is actually using. So, you might go and profile an application before it launches, and then, just after a year of entropy that like, new modules get added, or, you're dealing with like weird edge case content that's getting uploaded, and now you no longer know, your developers no longer know how much memory it actually needs. So often the developers' reactions are just, kick memory limit to 2 gig or something crazy like that. So if we can actually give them like real accurate information, visibility into how the app is running, then that's, we're going to be able to really boost utilization on the cluster.
I know there's a Prometheus exporter module out there for Drupal. Have you guys used that at all, or has anybody played with that?
Did we write that?
Yeah, we wrote that.
Yeah. So is that something that you actively use in production? Has that been helpful with some of the scaling issues that you've been talking about?
But we don't use it, but we will be using it, yeah. It's kind of a module that Kim and I wrote. Kim did the sort of library part of it, and I wrote the Drupal integration. So there's like a library to export the metrics in that format, PHP library. And then, yeah, we've just kind of been thinking about what we could add to it and what could be exposed to our like new platform that we're building. But yeah, feel free to jump in and have a look at it and add anything or create some issues or whatever.
Cool.
It's all got a plugin architecture, so you can easily extend it with different metrics.
Yeah, I mean, that came off the back of trying to do a bunch of monitoring ourselves. Like I know we were looking at, I think it's called the monitoring module in Drupal, which essentially exposes a bunch of statuses to users. So things like whether you've got module security updates required, or there's a bunch of things there. And then wanting to make that more of a standard interface. So looked at Prometheus, but there's a kind of a crossover there about, okay, well, what's just application information about statuses and what's actual metrics that we want to measure performance of Drupal and say whether it's in a healthy state or not. So yeah, it's kind of a bit of a grey area. We haven't really narrowed that down to what area we want to kind of focus on, because there's information there that's useful for operators and there's other information there that's used for application developers. So how we manage that is a question.
Sounds like you need some more community involvement.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. Well, that's a fairly decent segue into the next lightning talk. This one is going to be fairly quick and just generally cover the kind of community makeup of Kubernetes, how Kubernetes functions, a little bit on the governance model and kind of, what the SIG concept is and how that actually fits into the equation. I think that there's a fair amount of information that the Drupal community could learn from as a result of going through some of the structure that is in place as a result of the Kubernetes community. So I'm going to start by just going through a couple of links. The first one is github.com/Kubernetes/community. The first thing that you'll notice here is that there's a very good set of documentation, a very good understanding of what the governance model is, and basically every question that you could possibly have with being able to participate in the Kubernetes community is available here. The very first thing that you'll note coming out of the gate is that they immediately touch on the code of conduct so that people understand, what their expectations are, how they should behave, and kind of, what the values of the entire project are. And one of the things that I've learned as a result of helping to drive companies is that if you don't have a good code of conduct in place and you don't have proper expectations set and you can't articulate what your vision is and where you're going as a project, then things become increasingly difficult as more and more people become involved. So basically, the code of conduct is pretty thorough, pretty straightforward, and it models itself after the cloud native code of conduct and is represented in many different languages. Kubernetes, again, is a very huge project, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity that the Drupal community could learn from some of what's going on here. But if you have a few minutes, spend some time reading about it. It's generally just touching on things that you would expect. Be respectful for people, don't sexually accost people, no trolling or insulting, don't harass people, just be a generally good person. It's a shame that we have to put a lot of that into writing, but sometimes we do. Moving on from there, we get into the concept of kind of how the general community works, and they focus on kind of what we're doing here with a little bit more structure. We ended up forking some of what the Kubernetes SIG community does to create this group. So the README file on the GitHub repo is auto-generated in the same way that you would auto-generate an official Kubernetes SIG. And the idea there is that it's kind of like programming, right? You have an interface. That interface defines that there should be participants, that there should be maybe people governing the direction of a project, that there should be regular meetings, that there should be ways to communicate about those meetings, that there should be agendas in place and references to all of the documentation that's created in a very public way. So that's kind of what the SIG concept does. And then again on the README, they just go down and touch on how to get in touch with them, how to contact them, be it for a special interest group or for the Kubernetes project as a whole. They do run a Slack channel and even go as far as publishing Slack guidelines to help people understand, what it takes to get involved in the community, what it takes to create a new working group, what it takes to bring your ideas out there and essentially articulate them with different people, and how to get responses. So a lot of times, like, a new contributor coming into the Drupal Slack rooms, they might be a little intimidated as far as what rooms they need to go into or where they need to go to get specific information. This kind of documentation, these combinations of SIGs, working groups, and user groups, which we'll go over in a little bit, really play well to get new contributors up to speed quickly, because they can move at their own pace and they have all of the information that they need to be able to do it. They also do a really neat thing here with this tool called Tempelis, which is an automated way of managing Slack. So essentially, if you want to create a new channel, you open up a pull request. If you want to create a new conversation, you do it through Git, essentially, which is something that most developers are pretty familiar with by now. But it's a pretty cool way of doing things. The governance model is basically at so community governance.md. It's really nice to work through, and again, you'll note that they immediately focus on the code of conduct. So proper behavior inside of this community is really a critical part of who they are and what they are looking to accomplish. And then getting into the values, like I mentioned, it's very, very important to have a vision and values, right? And some of the values that they have here are very good tenets. A lot of them, could be applied in a lot of different software principles or disciplines. But distribution is better than centralization. So the idea of bottlenecks, the idea of maintaining a core group of people that are smarter than everybody else and end up becoming the bottlenecks because they're so good at what they do, is something that this project constantly strives not to do and has good checks and balances in place to help with that. They focus on the concept of community over product or company. So that's something that, I think the Drupal community does very well. We don't like to endorse products. We don't like to push products. We like to do things in a very generic and open way. And the community is very important. That's why we spend the time that we do on community and talking about it. Drupal would not be where it is without its community. They have a high tendency to focus on automation over process. I think that all of us can relate to this in some capacity. As complexity increases, it becomes more and more difficult to be able to interact with the system. As long as there's manual process in place to interact with the system, it continues to get more complicated until eventually it becomes untenable, but for a small amount of people. By focusing on automation over process, they open it up to be able to grow, essentially, and do it in a sustainable way. And then a couple more, inclusive is better than exclusive. I think that we've learned that pretty well through the diversity initiatives. It's great to have a wide range of opinions, a wide range of ideas, a wide range of people that are capable of helping and that might have different perspectives that we don't have. And the final one is evolution is better than stagnation. So I think the way that I interpret that is that, we need to be consistently open to new ideas. It's very easy to get caught in the trap that, oh, well, we've been working on this really great thing for the past X amount of time and nobody else is doing it, so it must be something special. But in reality, there might be better ways of doing what you're thinking about or better ways of addressing a specific problem if you can get the right kind of engagement from the community, the right kind of conversations happening. You tend to evolve instead of stagnate, which is very nice. Let's see, the general working structure of Kubernetes as a project is very interesting. It took Drupal a long time to get a good governance model in place, and it took a little while before we had initiative leads. So there was a time when things were a little bit more Wild West than they currently are. Let's see if I can hide some of the sun. But this is the basic governance model of Kubernetes. There's larger steering committees that act, I don't know, almost as like the general direction setting navigator of the ship, for lack of a better way of saying that. But the steering committees, they have project level governance. They may or may not be completely open and public, and they kind of have the last say in what the SIGs do. So they also serve as an arbiter of difficult conversations and help to really guide the community a little bit. They tend to stay out of the way as much as possible unless there's a specific reason for them to be there. Security is a good one that tends to have steering committees involved. There's not a lot of public communication that can happen around security issues. They need to be solved kind of in private, and there's a very specific structure for that to end up happening. The decision path that we tend to go through is very similar in both cases here. But these generally represent what your SIGs are. And your SIGs are your domain or horizontal special interest groups. And each of the SIGs are kind of what we're doing here. It's a core group of people that are focused in a specific topic area. That might be networking, that might be disk, that might be memory. For us, it might be CMSs or Drupal. And then from there, the SIGs have the ability to split out into different sub-projects. And the sub-projects are basically, each of these groups are permanent once accepted into the community until they self-deselect by determining that their topic area has been handled or isn't relevant anymore. So they can either deprecate themselves or they can be instructed from a larger steering committee or one of the special interest groups to go ahead and deselect. The other thing that's really unique that we have in the Kubernetes space that doesn't really exist in the Drupal space is the concept of these working groups. And working groups can be impromptu kind of cross-discipline conversations that need to happen in a cohesive way. So a good example of that might be, file systems keep coming up when we talk about Kubernetes and Drupal or PHP CMSs in general, and I work a lot with the Type 3 community. So for example, a working group might spawn up that has some folks from the Drupal community, some people from the Type 3 community. Their common bind is that they're PHP developers that are working on a common problem, and as a result of that working group, they may be able to do something that spans a specific special interest group, but provides a good amount of value. So in that particular example, they might come up with a composer package that is specifically meant to work with distributed file systems and then share that in a more global way that is suddenly accessible to solve the problems for both the Drupal space and for the Type 3 space. So it's a very interesting working arrangement that they have that I think works pretty well. Going into the details of each of these, this is the SIG reference. So I've already touched on this. It's a special interest group. It can be focused on things like networking, disk. They can go horizontal, focus on things like scalability and specific architecture topics, or they can be project related. So testing, release, docs, contributor experience. Basically, what they're looking for is a very standard structured model for being able to do these things. And these exist in a YAML file, essentially. So if you go into, I believe, the community group, you'll notice that there is a makefile. And this makefile will go through and generate all of the content for this entire repository. And as you go through each of these, you'll start to see that there's common similarities. So like, for example, if we look at this interest group, which is the drud SIG Drupal, it follows the same format as any other special interest group out there because it's all automatically generated. It's a very good structure because it takes a lot of things into account, helps you understand where the lines of communications are, what the contact points are for a specific project, allows that project to break up into specific GitHub teams so that, say, for example, there's an API group or some subset of the special interest group that has expertise that the rest of the community might be able to use. They can tag that group inside of a pull request in GitHub or an issue in GitHub and get a specific response from people inside of that group. So automatically it starts to break apart the workflow a little bit so that people can work more efficiently inside of this. Has the concept of sub-projects, and all of this again is represented in the YAML files. And what you need to do to kind of go through and get started, how to discuss things, how to get tied into Slack, and what it takes to actually contribute and where the recorded meetings are. So basically, it's a very quick and simple way to create a functional working group that, again, in the open source spirit, leverages a lot of what's already been done out there. A lot of the smarter people that are capable of managing massive projects, you have the ability to leverage what they've done and take it to your own project or become a part of this larger Kubernetes community. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity there, particularly for some of the distributions that might be in existence in Drupal, some of the different working groups that are in existence in Drupal. There's a lot that can be learned here. It's very simple to go about creating some of this stuff. So just so that you can see what was necessary to actually create the SIG that we currently run. There's a pull request out here that I have, and you'll see that it's very simple. You basically just edit the YAML file, edit specific parts inside of there, did a couple of modifications to be able to extend this outside of the Kubernetes Slack. But from there, you have the ability to go through, it's all auto-generated essentially. So once you have your proper structure inside of YAML, it's very easy to get this stuff going. Let's see what else we have here. So the way that you create one of these groups is by following this SIG process. You start with the templates. They give you very specific examples. So the idea here is that anybody can really pick these up, run with them, and be able to do really amazing things very quickly. There's a definite structure to all of this. And I again, think that the Drupal community can really, maybe learn a little bit from what's happening inside of Kubernetes. I understand that sometimes it's very difficult to want to change things, but there's opportunities out there, and this might be one of them that I think that we could benefit from pretty tremendously. So that was a quick introduction into the concept of SIGs, why they exist. The other thing that I really wanted to stress is the concept of the working groups and how those work, because I do believe that that gives SIGs like this specific one that are focused on Drupal to reach out to other communities and be able to get additional help in ways that we might not be able to expect. And ultimately, if we can, that typo 3 example with the file system is a key one for me. If we can come together and be able to have those conversations in a way that allows for others to participate, then we're going to get better at what we do. And that's basically it. Just a super quick walkthrough. Any questions? Cool. So let me get.
So do we have a all that documentation for this particular SIG?
Yes, I've taken a first draft at as much of it as I can, and it does link back to the Kubernetes project. So if there's any gaps there, definitely help me identify them, and we'll get those filled in and populated. The other thing that I'm definitely looking for is somebody to help basically govern this specific SIG. One of the requirements for doing a proper SIG inside of Drupal or Kubernetes is that there's at least 2 participants at that level, and that's an open invitation to anybody that would like to participate. So if you would like to participate, get in contact with me offline. happy to share the responsibility and help grow this a little bit. The other thing that I'd like to talk a little bit about is potentially changing the name of the SIG to be a little more generic. So right now it's called SIG Drupal, and it's focused specifically on Drupal. But I just spent a lot of time in Europe at a lot of PHP conferences and at Typo 3 conferences. And there are other people out there that would like to participate in something like this. And by branding it as a Drupal-specific activity, it might, in fact, discourage some of that participation. So I generally like to throw that out there as a question. Does that sound like something that, you know, would be worth addressing, or does that sound like maybe we should just leave it alone?
I think there's definitely value. There's a lot of similar challenges, you know, if you're using WordPress or, you know, any other PHP CMS. So yeah, sure. I mean, I think the more voices that we can have, the better.
One of the nice things that I saw the last time I did a composer install of Drupal 8 is that some of the Typo 3 packages actually are included in core Drupal these days. The other thing that I noticed about that is that when I do a composer install of a Typo 3 system, I don't see anything from the Drupal community that's contributing to that conversation. So one of the nice things I think would be to be able to get that cross-pollination going a little bit better. How about anybody else? Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I like it. I mean, you know, our hosting product, you know, we have to put a bunch of stuff into it. Probably the majority of it, frankly, is WordPress workloads. You know, and probably just in general more sort of just like hostile workloads, right? Like things that you cannot readily make cloud native. You know, I think some of the conversation can sometimes get a little academic about like maybe nice things to do if you have like one application or everybody can get on the same page, but you know, there's probably broadening that pool will make it easier to, you know, maybe address issues around like progressive cloud migration, you know, with Kubernetes, because a lot of these workloads just like either the budget is not there or the client buy-in or whatever is not there, but there's still things that we can do to improve that. So I'm all for it, and it'll probably give some better, you know, broad exposure, right? If we can get twice as many people on the call, it would be even better.
I think so, and you know, I would like to start inviting people specifically to attend this from different communities and see how that ends up playing out. So we'll see where it goes. Next agenda item is basically any recent challenges or celebrations that people would like to share as far as Kubernetes is concerned. I can go ahead and start. I've become particularly interested in the BuildPack project. So it's, I think, buildpacks.io. It's a relic of Heroku. I don't know, Heroku. I don't know if relic is the right word that I should use there, but essentially what Heroku has done is become part of the Cloud Native Foundation in supporting this specific project. They work with Pivotal Labs, which is a fairly large company that has a pretty decent interest in these build packs as well. If you get a chance to look through build packs, they're pretty phenomenal, and they kind of sound like they could be used as a way to strongly define what Drupal actually is on Kubernetes or in general. And the end result of these build packs are that they will build out a Docker container that essentially represents Kubernetes that might have, you know, all of the community generated logic of, well, how do we detect if it's a Drupal 8 site? How do we detect if it's a Drupal 7 site? Where are our config directories supposed to be? Where are our file systems supposed to be mounted? That kind of stuff. So I was pretty excited to jump across that. Anybody else have one they'd like to throw out there?
Yeah, I'll throw one out. So we've been grappling with how to handle backups and restores. and environment syncing and things along that line. So we started out many months ago looking into Arc, which is now Valero, which is kind of, the Kubernetes backup system, which takes all your objects. So we found that was a bit problematic in some ways because whilst, you captured the entire state of your deployment, it made it difficult if you just wanted to capture the state of the application itself, so the files in the database. So we, using KubeBuilder, have got a backup and a restore operator that, is like, so Drupal centric in terms of it looks up the config map and secrets for our Drupal deployments, and then just intuitively knows how to dump the database, dump the files directory, and then conversely do the restores in the opposite direction. So we're using Rustic under the hood just to manage the actual backup repository, and we've found this solution to be pretty reliable so far. It is in our open source operators project, so I can chuck a link to it in there.
Absolutely. Do you work with large archive files individually, or are you actually working with files on an individual level?
With Rustic, you get essentially like a repository. So you interact with it using the Rustic CLI, and you can say, dump out a particular file or a particular path at this version, or you can restore the entire thing. So it's quite flexible. It's even got a really nice fuse file system that you can play with. So when you create a backup, you can give it tags or some sort of label to identify why you created it, or what pipeline has created it. And in your fuse file system, you get this great like if you go into repo/tags, it gives you all the tags that have been created in that repository, and then go into each directory, and then it's got all the backups that were created with that tag. And it is a really amazing tool. So highly recommend you look into Rustic if nothing else.
Cool.
And so for initiating those backups, it sounds like you're using some sort of, we're not on AWS, so I don't know, the primitives are different, but it sounds like you're using some sort of like distributed, EBS or something like that. Like where do you run and what runs those backups? I'm sorry if I missed that.
So the backup, so our operator creates a job. So there's a couple of containers that run that, do the dump of the database, and then the Rustic copy things into that. The Rustic repo is just stored on a persistent volume claim. So we've got ours in EFS, but you could just as easily, ours is in S3. Yeah, but you could just as easily do it on an EBS volume or what have you. Okay, in terms of how they kicked off, so they're Kubernetes objects. So our developers can go through our command line. They can go skip a backup create, and that'll create a backup object, which then kicks off all of the other stuff. But you could also have other entry points like a scheduled cron job that creates them as well. Yeah,
we're still trying to kind of figure out the right. We're doing sort of DR appropriate backups with Valero because it's great for that, but sort of that more point in time, especially for the file system, right? With persistent volume claims, it's tough. So that's cool to see.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what we found in it, especially when we're going to try and leverage this for syncing environments as well. So that's just not having all of the Kubernetes objects is kind of a key requirement for that.
And Valero doesn't cover your once you move MySQL out of the cluster. So if you're running it on RDS or something to that effect, then Valero doesn't cover that for you. So you don't really have that full source of truth. Like you can either write a plugin, which then dumps the database and then stores it in Rustic or wherever you want it to go, or you just kind of defer to the on AWS RDS's backup policies and services. But then you have this kind of decoupled restore where if you want to do it on demand for a developer, yeah, you're kind of constrained by like what Valero can do as well as what RDS can do, and that doesn't really always work out too well. But yeah, we sort of found ourselves writing like that MySQL plugin, and then kind of going, well, Rustic is kind of the awesome source under this if you don't want to back up the Kubernetes objects themselves. If you want to take state, which is kind of the thing that we all care about the most, is that like files and database. The rest you can kind of recreate, like, or you can just still use Valero to snapshot those. But if you care about state, then yeah, Rustic is definitely worth a look for sure. And even if you're just running VMs or whatever you're doing, definitely have a look at Rustic. I'm looking at it. I'm gonna start using it just on my laptop, to be honest. It's pretty cool.
Awesome. And I'll go ahead and add this link into the agenda doc if anybody wants to take a look at that later on. Cool. Well, still want to be respectful of everybody's time, and we're coming up on the hour. It's been a really great conversation. Thank you all for your participation. And unless there's any additional questions, I look forward to seeing you next time around.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Enjoy.